I am a 20-year-old girl, and I've been in tune with the paranormal my entire life. Admittedly, I have become slightly obsessed, not in the summoning demons way, but more with too much research and spending my free time and all day at work, if I'm honest, listening to podcasts like this one. I have many stories to tell, but I decided to start with one that has been weighing on me for quite some time. I moved into a new place in December of 2017 with my new roommate, who we will call Nikki. When we moved in, I felt a massive weight off my shoulders because for the first time, I didn't feel any pressure in my home. Skip forward to May, and things had been going pretty well when we found out a family friend who was 16, we'll call her Morgan, didn't have a place to live, so we invited her to stay with us. I had known this kid for roughly 15 years and knew she came from a messed up family. She told us her dad was a Satanist and had cast some sort of curse on her, and now she was being followed by what she described as a shadow creature. With my past at the paranormal, I believed her but didn't really think anything of it and didn't want to take it too seriously because obviously we had some real emotional issues going on here. A few weeks passed and little inconveniences occurred, such as our coffee table being moved or mail being scattered across the floor. We have cats, so I didn't really think that much of it, but I was pretty annoyed about it. This kept happening, then gradually started getting weirder, like our laundry detergent being poured out under the dining room table, and the empty bottle was set up in the middle of the puddle. At around the same time, both Morgan and Nikki started having issues with sleep paralysis. Nikki used to get it all the time as a kid, but hadn't in years. The strange thing was that despite having separate experiences, both girls claimed to see the same thing, a child-sized black figure. The body was small, the head was too big, the hands were too long. It was always the same description. They couldn't see any other features, just a black outline. Luckily, I didn't have sleep paralysis, and I never have in my life, so I mistakenly thought I was safe. One night, I was home alone, and I was in a deep, depressing mood. Everything in the house just felt so heavy that I took a nap on the couch. When I woke up, I couldn't breathe. It felt like someone was pushing on my chest, so I sat up, and the pressure was gone. Then I noticed the room was dark, like unnaturally dark. My TV and the hall light were on, so there was no reason for my little portion of the living room to feel so enveloped in black. I decided to not really think about it, turned the TV up, and started scrolling through my phone. I heard heavy footfall from the kitchen directly behind me a moment later. It sounded like a full-grown man. I thought someone had come into the house while I was asleep, because we always left the sliding glass door in the kitchen unlocked. I know it wasn't the best thing to do, but I've changed since then. Too afraid to turn around and look, I took out my phone and went to Snapchat. I turned on my flash on my screen, and everything went completely black when I switched to the front-facing camera. My flash wouldn't work anymore, so I drew the courage to turn around. I saw nothing, and instantly the room was light again. I grabbed my keys and left until my roommate was off work. A couple of days had passed, and my roommate and I burned sage, boiled all the entrances, and told whatever was in the house that it was not welcome and had to leave. I don't really know where I truly fall on things like this, but I was willing to try anything. I was hoping that would be the end of it, and we didn't have any more things moved. Morgan had moved in with her brother, and the house seemed a bit lighter. Except Nikki was still experiencing some pretty extreme sleep paralysis almost every single night. Skip forward a few weeks and I'm laying in bed with my two cats. It's somewhere around 3 a.m. and I heard pots and pans moving in the kitchen. My cats woke up and started growling and hissing, which is out of character for them, so I grabbed my gun and checked every inch and corner of the house. Nikki was still sleeping. So I returned to my room, thinking it could have been maybe her cat, who likes to hide in the cupboards from time to time. 3 loud bangs made me jump so high the second I shut the door that I fell back onto my bed. I yelled for the thing to go away. I didn't want it to hear, and I had to leave. What felt like minutes later, I opened the door and my older cat ran out, turned into the kitchen, and screamed like she was hurt. I looked at her for like an hour and I couldn't find anything wrong with her. I went to bed crying because she was acting weird after that. The following day, I woke up and everybody was asleep beside me normally. Nobody seemed harmed. It just seemed like everybody was a bit freaked out. I woke up my roommate and told her about the night before. She explained that she had been awake when I got up and heard the 3 loud bangs herself, but was way too afraid to get out of bed. We oiled again and brought in her mother, who worked at the church, and she blessed the house. Not too long after Morgan's little brother moved in with me, everything kind of seemed to cease. It makes me wonder if Morgan's dad did curse her. He always told his 3 daughters they were mistakes and that he only intended to have 2 sons. That might explain everything. After she moved in with her older brother, it didn't really bother her anymore, and when her younger brother came to stay with me, the problem seemed to just move away entirely. All I know is whatever it was really negative. My depression had never been worse, and we were constantly arguing in the house. I'm just glad it's over.
So I told my story of what I thought was a dogman encounter on this channel a while back. Well, in that video, I stated that I had many weird and crazy stories. Since you graciously shared the last one, I thought why not share another scary encounter I had. As I said in the last video, I lived in Maryland, but before you think of blue crabs and beaches, I'm in a more rural area of the state. My uncle and aunt own a condo, however, at a popular beachcut Ocean City. In late May of 2018, I decided to take my friend Omar to the condo since no one was using it, and I got permission to take the keys and go. It's about a 3-hour drive from my home to Ocean City. And since I was a newer, good driver and recently got my provisional license, I decided to drive up for a vacation with my best friend. I own an old, black 1970 Chevy Nova, but it is fast as a roadrunner and very reliable. I, extremely hyping up with my new car, decided to purchase a roll cage, which would come into play later in the story. I was told it was stupid and costly, but my family eventually admitted how badass my car looked. Plus, very safe. So on May 28th, I drove my Nova to Omar's house about 5 miles away from mine, and we set off. Depending on which way you go to Ocean City, much of the drive is through farmland and small towns near the Potomac River. We were about 2 hours into the drive, and since it was still midday, we were not pressed for time, seeming how we would be there for about 2 weeks. As Omar snacked on chips loudly, he asked if we could shuffle some music on his phone. My phone was charging on a portable charger in my hoodie pocket, and the speaker was rolling at my feet. Since it was a vintage car, I didn't remove the old speakers or anything, just the stuff I needed since, I needed to fit in the roll cage. I said of course because I and Omar share the same taste in rap music. I picked up the speaker and he connected it via Bluetooth with his phone. Now, since I had a loud engine in the car, the speaker was equally loud to balance out the noise. Omar, of course, blasted the speaker to its max, but I wasn't complaining because the song went hard. While I was too busy rapping to the loud lyrics, I failed to notice the deer standing in the center of the street. Omar yelled for me to swerve, which I did, but as my rear bumper clipped the deer, my car flipped into the air, doing a full corkscrew and landed, sliding on its hood for 12 feet or so. We hung there by our seatbelt in shock, not fully comprehending the insanity of what just unfolded. I had busted my nose and scratched my face pretty bad, and Omar banged his forehead on the dash, but besides that, I'm pretty sure we were all ultimately fine. I looked over at Omar as he looked at me, and we just laughed. Partly because we lived, and mostly because we were in the weird state of nervous shock. It took a minute to compose ourselves, and still strapped in hanging upside down, we began to realize that a damn deer had flipped my car. We somehow got out at my door, crawling painfully through the window, which was shattered all to hell. As Omar stepped out, he met my gaze. I was looking at the same deer standing looking at us as if we had broken a twig. Omar's jaw dropped, as did mine. Maybe it's some metal statue some guy left out as a prank or something, Omar said. But as he did, the deer blinked. Thoroughly freaked out, we started back towards the car, making sure not to break eye contact with the thing. As my thigh bumped into the car, the deer stood up on its back legs and let out a scream that made my head hurt. Omar and I began to run, but knowing we had nowhere to run, we stumbled to the front of my car. But the thing was gone. Out of nowhere, it seemingly just vanished. Our hearts pounding, we tried in vain to flip my precious car. Thankfully, the roll cage I'd invested in not only saved our lives, but most of my car as well. Since flipping it wouldn't work, Omar had a good idea. Call Marco. Our friend Leo's uncle had a towing service, also working in insurance. Remembering the pain that it took to get a company to insure a teen driver like me, I quickly dialed Mr. Romani. He picked up instantly and greeted me like a brother. I shared him our situation and where the last gas station I saw was, leaving out the detail of a deer creature and replacing it with a hit-and-run driver. His employees were all off, but he told me he could drive us and pick up the car. He took us to the beach and took the car back. I quickly thanked him and asked him to hurry, thinking the beast might still be close. He hung up and we sat back to back on the side of the road. We waited, and it felt like we waited for a very long time. But it only luckily took him about an hour to get to us, because he lived closer to Ocean City than we did. He flipped the car using his truck and tools, and then loaded it on his truck. We hopped in and thanked him. He told me and Omar the car would be fine in his hands, and if we saw the car on the road that flipped us, to point it out. I and Omar glanced at one another and I said I would. The rest of the trip was uneventful. We spent our 2 weeks on the beach and boardwalk, and on our second to last day I got a call from Marco saying all was in order and the car was ready to be dropped off at the condo tomorrow. I told Omar the news and we all breathed a sigh of relief. As the amazing person he was, the work it took to repair my car was cost-free. I thanked him and we hung up. On the drive back, I made sure to take a different route home, while Omar looked up possible explanations of what could have happened. We were so caught up in the joys of vacation that we had barely mentioned it to each other. He found stories of things called skinwalkers, which would manifest and take the shape of creatures. I drove by car much more carefully on the way back, and got us home safely. Although for about 2 weeks after that there was always a tapping noise on my window, I could have sworn that I heard a voice that sounded like a bad imitation of Omar's voice, whispering as a lure to get me outside. I knew whatever was outside was not my best friend.
I was younger when this story occurred. Of course, all the adults say kids have a wild imagination, even though my buddy and I swore up and down that this had happened. Anywho, let's get to the story. It was toward the end of the week, and my mom and her boyfriend at the time, I wanted to go up the mountain to his family's cabin. I live north of Wyoming where the Bighorn Mountains reside. As a 12-year-old, I asked my mom if I could bring my buddy. For his safety, his name will be Nick. I called Nick and asked if he wanted to go to the cabin for the weekend. He had to ask his mom, and with our moms being close since they were younger, she said yes. Once we got everything in my mom's boyfriend's pickup, we went ahead and picked him up. As he hopped into the back of the truck, we talked about the general things that typically we would talk about, school, girls, etc. As we got to the cabin on the first day, nothing really major happened. We went four-wheeling and had hot dogs and s'mores, and the first night came and went without incident. The start of the next day is when things began to get a little spooky. The day went normal as much as it could. Towards the afternoon, we stayed around the cabin. My mom kicked us out at the place after lunch. We hiked around the house and we discussed a few different things, such as movies, shows, Call of Duty, etc., as well as grabbing a stick and pretending to be in Call of Duty, as weird as it may have sounded. Towards dusk, I showed him the treehouse, roughly 70 to 80 yards away from the cabin. The treehouse is a triangular platform 10 feet up in the air made of 2x4s and a makeshift ladder. The platform is between 3 trees on each point in a triangle shape, with rails to help with safety and all that. We had our legs dangling from the platform, talking again with the occasional silence between us talking. The forest became dead, which is a natural sign of a predator being around, which became a big red flag with both of us knowing that, especially with us going hunting every fall. We ended up getting the chills. Nick broke the silence. "Hey, do you see that?" As he struggles to get the sentence out. So that's all the light we had. A feeling of fight or flight. With the sun setting and it being all the light we had, that feeling of fight or flight came through our bodies. We began to hear something crashing through the brush, and in the distance, we saw what I can only describe as a giant, hairy humanoid creature peering at us from behind a tree that was roughly 50 feet away from us. It was at least 9 feet tall. Once I realized what it could be, the hair on the back of our necks stood up immediately. Our first mistake was looking at each other as shock kicked in. We looked back at what the creature was, and now it was a bit closer. It was kind of like suspense from those movies in like Jurassic Park when the raptor broke through the glass. We both hopped off, and as I'm looking back and forth between Nick and the creature, he hopped down and ran to the meadow in front of the cabin, closer to where we were. Looking back at the beast, I saw it was about 30 yards away. Fear filled my body, and I shook without looking away from the beast. I scooted my butt over as I was getting ready to run when I happened to look up and saw this thing face to face. I saw it in its full glory, hair covered head to toe, with a brown and blonde mixture of color. With the setting sun putting an orange tint to it, I ended up freaking out as though I had seen death itself. I jumped to the ground, rolling as I hit it, getting up and booking it to the same meadow as my friend. Nick was waiting there already. As I'm running, I hear twigs and sticks breaking behind us. I knew this thing was chasing me. Once I got closer to the meadow, I saw Nick telling me to run. As I got to him, I looked back and saw the creature in the tree line. As we were staring at it, it was staring right back. It did something we will never forget. With us catching our breath, we heard it. It was like a loud roar. We ended up booking it to the front of the cabin, slamming the door shut, and my mom and her boyfriend looked at us puzzled. They were asking us questions and we tried to answer, but as I said, they thought we were crazy. After dinner and having some s'mores, we ended up going to bed. The cabin had an open area upstairs, where the 6 beds were for us kids to hang out in. Towards the back of the upstairs is the screen door. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night to a sound of scratching on wood. The light outside the screen never turns off. I saw a hand scraping the deck floor outside. I freaked out because I swear it was the same hand from that creature. Last year at the beginning of summer, I visited my Nana's farm with my mom for just a weekend. Her farm is located in a very rural and secluded area, right at the foot of a mountain in a rural area of South Carolina. The roads in my area are poorly maintained and barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass by each other. The houses are spread out and pretty far back into the tree line from the road, so there is very little ambient light besides a car's headlights in the distance. So, my mom and I were driving along, her in the driver's seat and me in the passenger. It was around 11 p.m. and we were about 15 minutes away from Nana's, deep in the woods with the radio down, almost silent. We come onto this straight stretch of road in a heavily wooded area, and suddenly, this blur of a creature darts out across the road, right at the edge of our headlights. It was moving incredibly fast, but my mom and I got a really good look at it, and both of us agreed at what we saw. It was a reasonably large creature, roughly the size of a person, maybe just a bit bigger. Neither of us could make out the shape of the head, but we both remember it appearing to have a segmented body, as if it were emaciated and its ribcage were poking out. The reflection of a light made it hard for me to tell the color, but my mom said she remembered it to be dark, and she didn't see any fur or hair. It had long, gangly limbs as it moved across the road. It didn't run the way a dog or a horse would with all four legs. The best word to describe it would be that it was loping, using its front limbs to pull itself along and moving considerably fast. We both said something along the lines of, "What the heck is that?" as it crossed in front of us. As we got up to where it had crossed, I turned to look at it, and as we reached the other side of the road, where it was just out of our headlights, I looked, and I swear on my life, it stood up and it ran. Not like a dog, but like a person, as if it were bipedal. I immediately yelled that it had stood up, and we both started getting nervous. I honestly would have thought that I was going insane had another person in the car not seen it with me. My mom has always been a pretty level-headed person, and not superstitious in any circumstance, but she was incredibly nervous and was pretty scared about this, and we had to agree not to tell Nana about this to avoid scaring her. I recently came across an article about a woman who was hunting and claimed to have seen an invisible or cloaked creature that she likened to the predator from the movie of the same name. I read her story and saw the picture she took of the supposed predator. Regarding the picture, I believe it may be a result of a sun flare and a close-up of her face. However, I am not dismissing her story. In fact, I'm quite doing the opposite, as I also have had a similar encounter that led me to seek out if anybody else has experienced this predator-type creature in the woods. Now, on to my encounter. When I was around 5 years old, I used to play near the woods behind my grandmother's house. I played there frequently, and my grandmother would keep an eye on me from the kitchen or living room, as the house had large windows facing the woods. Every now and then, she would come out and check on what I was doing. I was really into digging in the dirt and collecting unusual rocks and arrowheads scattered around the area where my grandmother lived. This is Midwest Illinois, not far from Cahokia Mounds, so finding arrowheads was not super uncommon. Anyway, that day I remember picking out a spot to dig. I've been out there for quite some time because I remember I had a decent-sized hole going when something caught my eye in the tree I was next to. I don't really know how to explain it, but it looked like a heat wave coming off the branch. It was fall. I remember this because I had my pink jacket on, and I remember thinking that my mom was going to be pissed that I had dirt around the bottom of my arms from digging. I also remember there being a lot of leaves on the ground. Anyway, I am staring at this quote-unquote heat wave and realizing it was somewhat of a human shape. So here I am, 5 years old, and wondering why an invisible man is in the tree. I remember feeling scared but unsure what to do. Then it started moving and making a faint clicking sound. That is when I decided I was not supposed to see this and hightailed it back to the house. My grandmother saw I was pretty shaken, and I remember telling her I had just seen an angel. In my 5-year-old mind, I didn't know what else it could be. I had never seen aliens, heard of ghosts, or monsters at this point. So it really had to be an angel, because that's all my little mind could think of. Fast forward to when I'm about 12 years old or so. By this time, the encounter was way out of my mind. I loved watching action and sci-fi movies. My dad rented a movie called Predator. I'm watching it with him, and the first time you see the predator invisible/cloaked, I about crapped myself. All the memories from that day, digging in the dirt, came flooding back. I even asked my dad if the predator was real or not, and if anybody had known any animal that could do something like that. He wasn't really sure, but he told me the predator thing was definitely fake. It wasn't like today where we could just Google it and figure it all out, you know? I had no access to the internet. So again, I just put it out of my mind. Fast forward to about the year of 2004. I'm grown, had 3 small children, and just went through a separation from my husband. I moved to the next town over to an apartment with my kids. These apartments are all one-level duplexes and 5 buildings. I am at the very last apartment in the previous building. The apartments are considered in town, but they're more on the outskirts. A deep ditch runs behind the buildings. A chain-link fence separates them from this massive set of woods. There's about 6 or 7 trees on the side of our wall. If you follow the ditch a little bit, you'll hit this small forest that eventually leads to a country road with a bunch of extensive farmland and a bunch more forest and whatnot. I am a smoker, but I would not smoke in the apartment because of the kids, so I often went out onto the back porch. One night, I was up late doing laundry and stuff after the kids went to bed. I decided to go outside and take a smoke break before I went to sleep. I am back on the porch and started hearing this faint clicking sound. I immediately looked to the ditch because I had seen a groundhog bear a few days before, thought perhaps it was there again. The backyard is dimly illuminated by the nearby playground light to the right of the back porch. I only turned on my porch light when I went out for a quick smoke. I didn't see a groundhog or any movement from the ditch, so I went back to smoking my cigarette. The faint clicking sound kept happening, and a slight movement made me look up into the tree to the left of my porch. Something was there. I didn't see a groundhog or anything like that, but what I did see was vaguely in the shape of a humanoid. It had to have been the same thing that I saw when I was 5. It gave off that same distortion. It was crouched down on the branch with one arm out, holding on to the tree trunk. I couldn't believe it. Is this really happening? Is all I could think to myself. Has it come to kill me from seeing it all those years ago? All I could think was about my kids and everybody sleeping in the apartment. I ran inside and slammed the door, locking it immediately. I ran to my kids' rooms and closed all their windows and locked those as well. Then I turned off all the lights in the living room and stared out the blind at the tree to see if I could catch another glimpse of it. I sat there for what had to be about 10 minutes, maybe even more, and I never saw another thing. I began to think maybe I was just tired. Maybe I was just hallucinating it. And just as I was finally talking myself down, my neighbor's dog came running across the yard and started barking at the tree at the same branch where I had seen this predator thing. That freaked me out even more, because that dog was not a barker, and now it kind of reassured what I had just seen. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I have never seen anything like it again, and I don't know if I ever want to. Does anybody listening to this have any idea what it could be? I had a really strange experience last winter at Congaree National Park, just outside of Columbia. It's a beautiful boardwalk that winds through the swamps and cypress forest. If you look at the image, the story might make more sense. I used to live in Columbia, South Carolina, and I often visited the Congaree National Park, also known as the CNP. So I know the area fairly well. I would frequently hop on the fence and walk along the boardwalk at night. It was incredibly peaceful to stroll through the swamp and listen to the sounds of wildlife. There was never a ranger or a guard present after hours, so I was always alone. I went for a walk in October of 2021 with a flashlight. There were lots of insects and frogs making noise, but it suddenly stopped when I was about a mile in. I heard what I thought was my wife call me from the trail ahead, but she wasn't there with me. I was alone, and she was out of town. I then heard water sloshing to my right and saw nothing. I chalked it up to being tired and kept on moving. The wildlife started up shortly, and everything seemed to be fine again. Probably about 15 minutes later, I noticed that it got eerily quiet again, and I heard swamp water sloshing to my left one more time. But this time, it was much more deliberate, almost like somebody walking with purpose. I was in a thick portion of the cypress and couldn't see more than 20 feet in front of me at my best, and then I heard my wife's voice again. Again, she wasn't with me. She was out of town, certainly not moving through a swamp at 1 a.m. I saw what looked like a human silhouette move between the trees for a split second, but it was off. Very skinny, pale, and taller than me at 6 foot. I noped the hell out of there really quickly and ran almost the 2 miles back to my truck and didn't slow down until I heard the wildlife again. Like I said, this is a boardwalk that's in a swamp in the boonies. Nobody is walking around in the dead of night like I am. I'm probably the weirdest person around here. At least, I think so. I feel like I should add that I wasn't high or sleep deprived. I just like going in the woods at night. I was so freaked out by this, I came to the show and had to submit it 100% immediately because I wanted you to hear it. I'm convinced that I have encountered some sort of crawler or wendigo or something else that can mimic voices. Growing up on a small farm bordering a forest in Tennessee, I experienced numerous unexplainable events, but one series of occurrences remains a mystery to this day. When I was around 12 or 13 years old, I began having reoccurring dreams that took place in a forest, a location I often visited. In these dreams, I would come across a large black wolf with glowing red eyes. Strangely, each time I saw this wolf, there would be a death on the farm within a day or two, usually involving a chicken being preyed upon by a predator. During my final dream involving the wolf, a woman's voice accompanied its presence in the forest. I could hear her, but she always remained just out of my line of sight. Though her words are now hazy in my memory, I recall her saying, "Do not fear the wolf," among other things. As the wolf circled me, I didn't feel fear, but rather a deep sense of respect for its ancient power. After that last encounter, I never saw the wolf again, but the dreams felt more vivid than reality. Since then, I've wondered about the identity of the wolf and the woman in the forest. These dreams marked the beginning of my fascination with the paranormal, leading to many more inexplicable experiences. I've often wondered if I connected with the forest spirit or a Native American presence during these encounters. First off, I want to thank you for telling the first story I submitted a few months back. You did a wonderful job, and I'm very grateful you decided to tell it. This next story takes place in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State. I just came back from my second Iraq deployment and had been assigned to the USA Air Ambulance Detachment at Fort Drum, New York. 7 months later, our unit was transferred to Yakima Training Center in Yakima, Washington. The constant deployment and change, but a great deal of strain in an already weak marriage, resulting in her moving back to live with her folks in New Hampshire. I was depressed about it, and when a 4-day weekend came up, I decided to head into the mountains for a little time for myself. The road was rough, going as soon as I left the highway. I kept driving in my 2000 Ford F-150 until I saw another road about 10 miles away from the highway. This road was overgrown and looked like it hadn't been used for some time. Since my intention was to completely escape away from people for a few days, I took it. The road was hardly wide enough for my truck. It went all the way and over a ridge into a quiet field in the middle of the woods. Small steam made its way through the center. I pulled off the road and decided to make a camp. Within a short period of time, a campfire was made and the back of my truck was set up for sleeping. I had an old camper shell and an inflatable mattress with blankets and such. I made a dinner of steak and potatoes and watched the sun disappear below the horizon. It was beautiful out there. No sounds of cars or anything. I felt like I honestly had the whole world to myself, and I felt good for the first time in a long time. A few drinks later of single malt scotch, I decided to go to bed and get some sleep for an early start the next day. I had planned to do some fishing and maybe have a small hike. The weather was cool and the stars and the moon were clear. I fell asleep as soon as my head hit the pillow. A few hours later, though, I was woke up to a growl outside my truck. Heavy footsteps circled around my vehicle, and then I heard a high-pitched scream. I normally, at the sound of being paranoid, carry a handgun while camping, and this time was no different. I reached over and unholstered my Charter Arms Undercover 38 Special and sat with my back to the cab. It was still circling the vehicle, and I managed to glimpse it through the side camper window. A dark and mysterious-looking woman and a short, plump man were staring at my vehicle. They did not look armed, so I decided to go ask them what they wanted. I got out of the truck and looked in the direction I had seen them, but there was nothing. I searched the entire area around the site. Nothing. I got back in the truck and locked the door. It must have been my imagination, I told myself, and a few hours later, I eventually passed out again. I again awoke to the truck rocking and screaming and hollering in the early morning as a person was hitting my camper shell repeatedly and yelling obscenities. I did not want to remain there any longer. I slid through the sliding window in my cab, started the truck, and got the heck out of there. When my headlights came on, I saw a circle of people in robes surrounding me. I threw the truck into reverse and punched it out of there. They jumped out of the way as I barreled into reverse through their circle and took off like a bat out of hell, with them running behind me on foot. Then I got to the main road. I floored it out of there. Unfortunately, a highway patrolman was right there, and I was pulled over. He came to my window, and after I related the story of what happened, he told me that area I was in was home to a religious cult. The road I went up to was supposed to have a no trespassing sign and a chain. I'm happy nothing more sinister happened.
Some backstory. This was 2 days ago. My family owns about 80 acres of land, and we lease it to my grandfather for his cattle since he has so many. He has about 3 farms that he owns personally, but he needed more space to put his other 20 head of cattle. Now, I'm getting to my story. My grandfather called me at around 8:56 at night, saying that he had lost track of one of the newborn calves and needed my help. We meet at the old bunkhouse on our property. He said we should split up and search the land, and we took off with our four-wheelers. I drove around the upper, more forested area of the place. I came around and the sun had finally set. It was dark now, so I turned on my lights and drove through the trees. I kept searching for the calf, but I couldn't find it. I stopped my four-wheeler and it was quiet. I pulled out my flashlight and decided to look on foot for a minute. I walked a little bit away from my 4x4 and I heard some light rustling. It was so quiet that I didn't know if I actually heard it or not. I slowly turned my head in the direction and slowly shined my light there. And there it was, the calf. But it was in the lap of, well, something. I can only describe what it looked like because I have no words to name this thing. It was sitting there with the calf in its lap, had one hand on its back and one in its stomach. Its eyes were huge and it had no pupils. Its head was a skeleton shape, but it was like wrapped in tight skin. You could see the skull inside of its head. Its nose was 2 holes below where they should be. It looked like it didn't even have a mouth, just smooth skin. But there was blood covering the spot where a mouth should have been. We sat there staring at each other for at least 5 minutes. Then, that's when it started opening its mouth, slowly, and its head rolled back. It opened its mouth wide and bent down to its neck. Its teeth were filed and they all curved back towards the throat. It didn't have a tongue, and you could see down his throat. It didn't scream or yell or anything really. It just quietly kind of screeched, and then slowly came back to the state that it was before. I forgot to mention that it was as tall as me sitting. It pulled its hand out of the calf and started standing slowly. I forgot to mention its hands weren't exactly big, but they were long. Its fingers didn't have fingernails, but instead the fingers were sharp points. When it finally stood all the way up, it was an estimated 10 feet tall, and I was about a solid 6 foot. It took a step forward and I finally snapped out of it. I turned and sprinted to the 4x4. As I ran, I looked back and it was following me, but it seemed like it was saying something to me, like it wanted me to stop. And as I thought that, it took 2 strides and it was only 5 feet away from me. I hopped on the 4x4 and was trying to get it to start. I looked back and it was looking down at me. Its sharp claws were coming towards me slowly, as if it were trying to console me while I grieved at a funeral. I started it and took off, and while I was driving over the roar of the engine, I heard quick footsteps behind me. I left the tree line and I rode down the hill and stopped and looked up. It was there looking at me, still the same abstract look on its face. It just walked back into the woods. The day after I came back to that spot I saw the day before, there was a trail of blood that led to a field in the back of the property, and all that was left of the calf was some bones with a little meat in the pile. Right next to it was its skin. I was going to bury it, but I had forgotten to bring a shovel. I left and went to get one, but when I came back, the pelt was hanging from the wall in the bunkhouse. I looked upon the hill, and it was watching me. Last night, when it was really quiet, and I was close to being asleep, I heard some twigs snapping outside my house. I looked out the window from the blinds and I saw a pair of white eyes staring back at me.
A little background before we begin. Everyone says the same thing. I'm an avid outdoorsman. I hunt, fish, camp, hike, and kayak. My buddy is not an outdoorsman. He goes party camping with me, and that's about it. We have never experienced anything like what I'm about to tell you. This happened in 2018. The day before, we were camping at a lake in the Nicollet National Forest in northern Wisconsin. The trees were changing color at the time, and the leaves were starting to fall. It was freezing at night, being October. My buddy got cold quickly and drove around in the mornings to warm up. We would go into town to get gas and supplies, mainly beer. There needed to be more to do at our campground, and with no hiking or activities, day drinking is kind of what we relied on, listening to music and talking about party camping. The next day was going to be an overcast, rainy day, so we decided to spend it by driving around, looking at other campgrounds and scouting them out for other trips. We quote-unquote partied that night and went to bed late. Everything was normal. We heard wolves, owls, loons, and all the other good stuff. But after a while, we heard nothing. Just pure quiet. It was peaceful. It started raining early the next day. Just a drizzle at first, but enough to make camping a pain. We got up late, hungover and cold. We dressed in our hiking gear and jumped in the car to get warm. We left the lake campsite a little after noon to check out the other campgrounds. It was about 5 miles to the next one and basically on the highway without privacy. We would generally check them out, but it started raining very hard. We stayed in the car, marking down the campsites we liked and the ones we didn't. This one we didn't really particularly like. Another thing about this national forest is there are campsites and campgrounds spread out absolutely everywhere. They need to be connected in some sort of way. So you have to get on the highway, find a little sign that says campsites this way, and then drive down a dirt road for 10 to 15 minutes to find them. We made it to about 8 before 5 o'clock. We were at the entrance of what was going to be our last one for the day. It said the road was 15 miles. I went slowly, not trying to kick too many rocks up into my car. The road was honestly pretty eerie. The trees made the street look like we were going down a cave. A couple of minutes in and the rain had stopped. At the campsites, there was no one there. It was beginning to get dark. We had been in the car all day and we were ready to get out and stretch our legs. We parked at the first campsite and got out. The birds were singing their lullabies and everything was still. There were 5 campsites in a circular clearing with thick trees all around. The sites were open to each other and could have been better for my camping. Only if you rented all the sites. Honestly, we walked around the circle and noticed a sign that said group camp pointing up a trail. We started down the gravel path full of wet leaves to the site. After walking for some time, I realized it wasn't even close. I raised this concern with my buddy, but we wanted to see the site anyway. It was almost dark out, but we could still see rather well. I noticed the birds stopped singing at this point. It was a hushed tone in the forest. All we heard was our own footsteps. We made it to the group site after walking for quite a few minutes. It was still and nothing was moving. We were at the end of the trail looking into the area. The hair on the back of my neck started to stand up, and my skin crawled. Standing, about 30 feet to our left, was a very massive, dark-haired creature. I was frozen with fear. My buddy hadn't noticed it yet and was still walking. I said his name quietly. He must have known something was wrong because he stopped and turned to his left immediately. We were both frozen. I was standing there what felt like minutes, but it couldn't have been more than a few seconds. I knew what it was, but in my head I was saying they weren't real. I couldn't even speak. Then it started slowly moving towards us. It started yelling some deep throaty gibberish at us. Against all my instincts to hold my ground and fight back, we ran for it. It ran with us, and it was still screaming. We kept running for our lives. It was running parallel to us. Its scream was replaced by what I can only describe as a deep, throaty huffing noise. It was crashing through the dead brush, keeping up with us effortlessly. We were running, trying not to slip on the leaves or just die. We saw the car and had hope. As soon as we got to the clearing, it stopped. It hit a tree, more like it punched through a tree. We heard a huge crack and crash. We were almost to the car when this massive tree hit the ground next to us. We then listened to what can only be described as a great ape beating its chest in triumph while screaming. We jumped in the car and sped away. The rest was a blur. We got back to the campground, packed up, and left at night. We never spoke about it again and haven't talked about it since. I'm almost entirely possible what we experienced that day was a Bigfoot.
The events I describe are accurate. I will carry them with me for the rest of my life. These incidents occurred around midsummer in 2013 or 2014 in a small town in rural New Hampshire. My friend was present for both occurrences and witnessed the same things I did. The first event took place on a warm summer night. My friend and I lived in the same town, about 2 miles away. At the time, I had my license, and he did not. So I would drive to his house to hang out and play video games or pick him up and drive back to my place to hang out. Right down the hill from my place is this old textile mill that has been closed down for a while. Pretty much as long as I've ever seen it, it's been run down. And there have always been rumors going around about how people died working in the mills years back. And sometimes at night, if you look into the windows, you can see ghostly figures still dressed in the old-time clothing. Across the street from the mill is a dirt parking lot where telephone companies park their work trucks and grab them in the morning. I had just picked up my friend and drove back to my house. As we were driving by that dirt parking lot, we happened to notice something. The telephone company trucks were big, and you could see underneath them, on the other side of one of the trucks, I saw a pair of legs and feet, as if someone were standing there motionless. The legs were very pale and stood out in the darkness. There were no shoes, just bare feet. It looked like the legs of a child around 8 years old. As we kept driving and passed the truck, the feet and legs disappeared like they were never there. We were going fast enough that they could not have run off before we passed them if that was an actual person. I asked my friend if he had just seen that, thinking I might have been crazy. "You mean the white legs and the feet?" he asked. To this day, I still hope it was our imagination playing tricks on us. But sometimes I wonder if a child may have died working in the mill many years ago when child labor was legal. This last event happened to me and my friend. It was late at night and I was driving home after the movies. Let me remind you that I live in a very rural, woodsy town. We were on this stretch of road close to this place where we did see the ghost legs originally, with woods on either side, and we're not driving very fast as the speed limit for that road is only 20 miles per hour because it is very windy. Just remembering this next part sends chills down my spine as I write this. This thing flies over the road, just above the tree line as we drive. It flew next to a street light, lighting the creature well. At first, I thought it was some type of bird, But as more of it appeared by the light of the street, I realized this thing was much too large to be any bird of any type. The creature we saw had the body roughly the shape of the size of a large wolf, but with short fur. It had bat-like wings big enough to support its weight and size. Unlike a bird, the creature had front and back legs and a tail. Luckily, I didn't see it long enough to get a good description of its head or face, and I'm glad I didn't, because I was already completely paralyzed with fear. Later, my friend claimed it had red eyes. My friend and I did not say a single word the whole time this happened. The rest of the way to the house, we said nothing. When we finally pulled into his driveway, I shut off the car, and we both just silently started freaking out. I was hoping I was going crazy, and to this day I would think I was, but someone saw the exact creature I did. We went inside and told his brother, who thought we were absolutely crazy. After that, we said nothing to anyone for a long time because who would believe us? To this day, I don't know what kind of creature we saw that night. Just thinking about it, going to the woods in that town now scares me. If anyone has any idea what it might have been, or has any strange creature stories around New England, I would love to hear about it in the comments.